Hi, everybody. This is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. It is May 7th, and we are going to look at a series of transits that are taking place today and this week. There are a number on my list that I want to talk about today, and we'll start at the top. We have Venus in the sign of Gemini, who is currently moving into a square with Neptune, so that's a big deal. It's a fast-moving transit, but it's a powerful one, so we're going to talk about that a little bit, Venus Square Neptune. We're also looking at the Sun moving into a direct opposition with Jupiter. That's a very significant transit, so we'll take a look at Sun opposite Jupiter, perfecting in the next day or two here. Then we're also going to look at the recent square from Mercury to Pluto, which is just finishing up. It happened literally just in the past 24 hours. So we'll be looking at that. And then Mercury is immediately moving into an application with Mars. This is going to take place, it's going to take it a little bit, but we're going to talk about that, what to expect from that transit, and how that figures into the movement of Uranus into Taurus. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about Uranus into Taurus today because I'll be looking at that in days to come. We'll be looking at that extensively, basically, for the next week. So I'm going to save my good stuff for a future talk on Uranus entering Taurus. But in the meantime, so far I have about 75 Uranus and Taurus reports that people have ordered, and I'm going to be taking those all the way up until Uranus actually enters Taurus. So you still have about a week left to get a report for yourself if you would like one. They're not long. They're just short, personalized recordings that I'm making. So here's how you get one if you'd like one. You will go to my website, which is www.nightlightastrology.com. Under the Events tab, there's a drop-down menu that says Payments and Donations. You'll make a donation for suggested donation ranges between 40 and 75. And then after you have made a donation, you'll email me your time, date, and location of birth to nightlightastrology@gmail.com. And I will add you to my report list. I'll have these done probably by the mid to end of June. It's going to take me a while, 78 of these reports I have so far. They're anywhere from basically 10 to 20 minutes long, and I take some time prior to making the recording to research your birth chart. So all in all, it's about like the equivalent of like a half an hour astrology reading, and that's why the donation range is lower. I do ask if people have the ability to pay higher on the scale that you do. That helps with people who don't have as much. Not everyone has donated even between the suggested scale. So, and I always try to make things accessible for everyone. Okay, so that's the situation with the Uranus and Taurus reports. I'll be doing those for offering those to people for like another week. All right, but we're going to talk today about Venus square Neptune, Sun opposite Jupiter, Mercury square to Pluto and Mars. It's last quarter moon today, so there's really a lot of stuff to talk about on this particular day. Well, it's like that. This month of May is actually, I would argue, probably the busiest, most dynamic month of the year, similar to the big eclipse of last August, which was, it really, was very powerful astrological month in August with the big eclipse that came through. So yeah, we have the same feeling going on this month. I'll answer your question there. I see a question come up. I'll answer that later if you stick around. Okay, so yes, in short, yes, it would make a good conjunction with the Kickstarter reading you received. So let's just start off with like last quarter moon, because that's like, I always say this, but let's get our finger on the pulse, and the pulse starts with the moon. So it's a last quarter moon kind of moment, and the new moon coming in about a week will happen on the same day that Uranus enters Taurus. So this isn't just your typical last quarter moon. Last quarter moons typically are like the process in plant life where the fruit has fallen off the vine. It's been ripe for picking for a while, but now it's reached that critical transition moment where it is no longer good, meaning it's going to rot. It's changing from the fructification stage of the new moon and the waning gibbous into the last quarter waxing or waning crescent, which is really about deterioration, death, and decay. That critical transition moment is typically described as a moment of letting go. And although it's cliched, it's really, that's the best. It's cliched for a reason, because it's true. The last quarter moon moment will ask you to surrender to something. It will also ask you to separate illusion and fantasy from fact. So the dark moon, oftentimes we forget, that the light of the moon is a reflective light. It's not an original light, but reflective. And so the moon has traditionally been associated with sleep and dreams. The moon is also associated with delusion and intoxication and even poison. And one of the reasons that it's associated with those things is because those things are all loosely associated with the idea of fantasy, or something that is reflective but not original. So we know that ancient astrologers like the Platonists and the yogis and so forth believed that this world is sort of like a holodeck, that you're in a kind of virtual reality machine in the material body, that your consciousness is something that is eternal and ultimately different from the material form that you're currently inhabiting. This is not the only material form you've known. And so we have to be very careful not to get caught up in illusion, not to get caught up in falsehood, etc. Last quarter moons are moments where that false light, so to speak, or at best a reflective light, it can be a false light though. If there's any false light in your life, every last quarter moon gives us an opportunity to see things as they are and to start letting go of the delusion. And our fantasies are with us all the time. We have fantasies operating with us right now on both conscious and unconscious levels, and these things are happening all the time. So last quarter moon comes through, and the reflective light is falling off. The skin of the serpent is being shed, so to speak. And so it's a good moment to get real, to rejuvenate as we purge. So the last quarter moon is associated all the way down to the new moon is associated with bloodletting, purgation, renunciation, asceticism, things where you're basically saying, a little will go a long way. I don't want to oversaturate. I don't want to overfill my stomach. I don't want to overfill my mind. You're starting to empty out. So I think that's where we're starting. That's the pulse of the moment. It's springtime, right? So it's a funny time to be having a last quarter moment. If you're in the United States, of course, we're talking about springtime here. If you're somewhere else, and this wouldn't necessarily apply to you, but in the Northern Hemisphere, it's springtime. And so spring it's a funny time to have a last quarter moment, because as everything is growing and blossoming in the middle of spring Taurus season, there's a funny sense in which we are already anticipating the loss to come. It's a very good moment to be hesitant about that purchase you're about to make. It's a very good moment to double check and make sure you're not going overboard. We're going to talk more about that when we talk about the sun opposing Jupiter, which is coming up in the next 24 hours and has been building for a while. But there is always an opportunity to overdo things in Taurus season anyway, because Taurus is a very luxurious sign, and the fullness of spring is a beautiful gift that we should celebrate. But there is sometimes Venus-ruled signs will overdo things. Jupiter-ruled signs can overdo things. So we want to be very careful at a last quarter moon moment, especially in the Saturn-ruled sign of Aquarius, that there's an aura of letting go and of conservatism in the air today. Just conserving your energy, not wasting anything, not being frivolous, being a little cautious, letting go, eating a little less, starting to slough off the excess. So that's kind of in the air right now. And it's funny that that's what's happening, given that the sun is about to perfect this opposition to Jupiter. I actually talk about that because it dovetails better before I talk about Venus Square Neptune. So in the sky right now, the sun in about 17 Taurus is moving into an opposition with Jupiter at 18 Scorpio. So that'll perfect between now and basically Wednesday afternoon. You have a window of about the next 48 hours where, even 72, the next 3 days, where you're really going to feel the sun opposite Jupiter. So what does this look like? Well, first of all, you have two planets that are associated with life and life-giving qualities in ancient astrology. The sun, considered, unless you're combust the sun, meaning very close to it in the sky as a planet, generally the sun is thought of as life-giving, supportive, and encouraging of growth. Anytime you see in a horary chart, for example, and you see the sun and the moon getting together by a trine or sextile, it's often an indication that the thing will go as the person is hoping it will. Or if you see a planet, getting a trine from the sun, it often means confirmation or support. So the sun is, associated with life-giving qualities. It's also associated with authority and rank and fame. People who are knowledgeable, or people who are in charge, people who are very visible. The sun, how can you miss the sun, right? Unless the clouds are out, you really can't miss the sun, brightest object in the sky. So fame, visibility, rank, etc. Now, when the sun is coming into an opposition with any planet, there's always the potential for clashes with authority, because the oppositions are naturally, like they sound, they're oppositional. So we always have the potential to get into some kind of clash with an authority figure. Jupiter, however, is a little different, because Jupiter is unique when it gets into oppositions with other planets. We'll talk about that in a second. So at any rate, that's the sun. Then you have Jupiter, and Jupiter is associated with life-giving qualities as well as related to the qualities of heat and moisture. So hot and moist, like the inside of, like the beneath the canopy in the rainforest in the Amazon, which I've been numerous times. I've been blessed to be able to travel there, and it's a really beautiful place. But it's like a little it's like a greenhouse. I mean, that is what it is. So anyway, you're in the jungle and you're walking around, and it's wet and it's hot and it's humid, and there's water in the air and there's water in your shoes, and I mean, and it's really hot at the same time. Basically, that's Jupiter on a sort of elemental qualitative level. So Jupiter is prolific. It's supportive of growth and life. And where there is growth and life and development, there's usually abundance. There's food. There's wealth, because you get money when you sell your crops. There's abundance, which means there's hope. When a kingdom in the old days, had a lot of food and everyone was well fed and everything was stocked up, all the granaries were stocked and everything like that, the feeling of being invincible could easily grow within the national psyche, within the king's psyche, etc. So the astrologer's job was always to keep watch and be like, yeah, but be careful, because there's a Saturn-Jupiter opposition coming up, and Saturn will cut down that excessiveness that Jupiter brings. So we always have to be careful with Jupiter, because Jupiter creates the environmental feeling and actual tangible results of growth and expansion, which tend to build our sense of faith. Where there is results, we tend to say, okay, I believe, I'm on board. I believe in this. I believe in myself. I believe good things are coming, right? It's harder to have faith in times of where there's, meager results. And yet that's in some ways where real faith is cultivated, because we know that in the promise of the promise of winter is spring, and the promise of spring is winter, so to speak. So, or summer or winter, however you want to look at that. So we know that these cyclical dynamics take place. So with Jupiter, you always have to be aware of what expands will eventually diminish. Similarly with the sun, what rises will eventually set. The king will eventually become an old king who will be replaced by a new king, or a new queen with a young queen. So these cyclical dynamics you have to always stay aware of them in astrology, because astrology is not just about understanding the literal depiction of what the planets are doing, but it's also about understanding what exists in the shadows, because none of these planets exist in a vacuum. So anytime you read a planetary transit, you're always trying to understand, well, Venus represents love, but its opposite is Mars, which is strife. Mars represents strife, but his opposite is unity, which is Venus. Jupiter represents faith and confirmation, but Mercury represents careful, thoughtful skepticism and questioning. Okay, Jupiter, you think you have $1 million and you're going to be on top of the world forever, but how much will you have to pay in property taxes for your $500,000 house? You see, so Mercury holds Jupiter in check, and Mercury says, well, I don't know about this, I don't know about that. We should always just hold on to everything we have and never take any risks. And Jupiter will say, well, wait let's see about that. Maybe we should take a risk. So all the planets are always working like this. Well, what happens? What are the natural dynamics that you have to pay attention to when this planet of authority and light comes into an oppositional, powerful contact with Jupiter, which is this planet of abundance and greatness, and it's so prolific and it feels so confident and everything like that. Well, it's a great moment for you watch as things are expanding, right? So I put out, for a simple example, I put out the Jupiter into Uranus reports, and I said, hey, this sounds like this would be a fun thing to do, and they just completely took off, right? So I've had a whole huge amount of them ordered in the past couple of weeks. I had no idea that it was going to take off like that. And I'm looking and I'm like, oh, well, of course, like you've got the Sun and Jupiter coming into an opposition as this project that I started is happening. So it's really abundant. Here's what would be stupid of me. If that influx, everyone, if you work for yourself, you know what I'm talking about very well. You get an influx when you work for yourself and you think, oh gosh, well, now's the time for me to go and, buy a bunch of stuff that I really want. Oh, no, right? Because if you study astrology, you're like, no, because this influence is temporary. So wherever there's growth, there's eventually going to be diminishment. So, over time, I've grown a little bit wiser and been able to say, well, I don't necessarily expect that business is going to be booming during a certain time, but a Sun-Jupiter opposition is a pretty good time to see a project really grow and flourish. However, the advice is be careful not to get overly confident about whatever's happening. The sun will set, the sun will set, the great profits will diminish, natural costs will arise, etc. So I picked up a fortune cookie last night. I got home from a week vacation with my daughter, and it was really fun. It was my first total daddy-daughter vacation. We went and saw my mom and dad in Michigan. And, we got home, and I was too tired to cook, so I picked us up some Thai food. And my daughter and I were eating Thai food together, and I had a fortune cookie. And I opened it just as I was thinking, maybe we should get some new blinds, because we're thinking maybe we have trouble at night sleeping because so much light comes through. And I'm thinking, oh, there's an influx in business right now. Maybe it's a good time to buy those blinds. And I opened up this fortune cookie, and I mean, going against my own advice of like splurging on something, it's not totally necessary. Like we can get by, it's fine. But I'm thinking, well, So when I opened the fortune cookie and it said, the cookie just said to me, you should be able to hold on to the money you make. And I was like, okay, well, that's clear. So, I was like, it was a good Jupiter Sun oppositional moment. So I give this little piece of advice from my actual lived experiences. That's usually how astrology works for me, is I pay attention, I do the best I can to know what we're supposed to know about these transits, but it's easy to forget. So sometimes we need our fortune cookies. I guess that's the message. So at any rate, the other things that can happen here are when you have, basically when you have the Sun opposite Jupiter, you can also be dealing with issues around authority figures and men. Men, because the Sun tends to be issues related to the paternal. Now, that's not always the case. It can be people in leadership in general, people who are prominent or very visible or in leadership positions. And when Jupiter opposes the Sun, Jupiter is also a planet that's naturally associated with law and justice. So you, well, more, I'll go into that some other time. But when you have Jupiter opposing the Sun, sometimes you have a higher governing body or authority or system or law or code or some greater, almost transcendent authority. We're talking about Zeus here, right? Zeus is Jupiter. And it can oppose or hold in check or attempt to thwart or coerce or harm or even damage someone in power. So for example, a typical Jupiter Sun opposition might be seen when someone has a board trying to outvote the CEO or something, where there's some kind of attempt by a body or a group with its own order and law, and it's attempting to usurp or confront or or directly rebel against the authority of someone within the company. So that can happen quite easily. Then you also see with the sun opposite Jupiter, you also sometimes see the passage or transmigration of the soul out of the body of men. So that might sound really weird because you're like, Jupiter is a planet of life. It's really prolific. Like, why would you want to see, how could you see death? Well, because a lot of the times you have the image of something proliferating and potentially at the same time afflicting the sun, which is, let's say, a man or a father or a grandfather or a leader or something like that. Well, that's a pretty good image of Cancer. That's a pretty good image of a heart attack where something may enlarge the heart, or it's a pretty good indication of someone potentially getting a little obese or overeating or overdoing something. And Jupiter is also associated with the wisdom that the soul possesses, in a sense, as it goes from one lifetime to the next. And so Jupiter in your chart might tell you something about your innate wisdom, your innate deep understanding, lived understanding of things. And so, especially in Scorpio, it's a deep water sign. And it's a sign of Mars, which is a planet associated with death. So it's very possible, though, that when the soul leaves the body, that you can understand it as a moment of karmic review, right? We say at death, the life flashes before the eyes. And, the life review contains in almost innumerable amount of events and activities and information in just the blink of an eye. So people who have had near-death experiences say it was everything. I saw my whole life flash before my eyes. Well, Jupiter is that everythingness and that capacity for something to be incredibly expansive, but also really acute and powerful as this quick moving opposition takes place. So you often see Jupiter wrapped up in end of life moments where people die. There's often Jupiter. Sometimes the soul also is dying right as it's basically upgrading from an evolutionary point of view. So, as spirit souls, in the Bhagavad Gita, we're told that our progress is never taken away from us. The Srimad Bhagavatam says the same thing. This is Bhakti Yoga in India, something I study a lot. Your progress can't be taken from you. And so death as a Jupiterian moment is also, in a sense, a vision of the progress of the soul drawing closer to the divine. So at any rate, those are just different ways of thinking about why you might actually see the passage of men or male figures. And that can be both literal or sort of metaphorical or figurative, where, again, the death or transition of a leader or public figure being surpassed by something or taken over by something. And there's some deep karmic lesson that comes in at the same time, the planet of wisdom coming through. So those are different things to think about with Sun opposite Jupiter. Now, let's talk about the transit that is perfecting very shortly. That's unless you have questions about, if anyone has questions about Sun opposite Jupiter, feel free. Okay, so the next transit that we're going to talk about is Venus Square Neptune. Now, Venus Square Neptune is perfecting. I'll give you the exact time. It looks like it's about 6 o'clock tonight or something like that. So it's really 6. That's Eastern time. So that's really soon. It's in the process of perfecting right now. Well, let's talk about Venus. Venus is friendship. Venus is cleanliness. Venus is harmony. Venus is love and romance and beauty, sensuality. Venus is related to hedonism, desire, and pleasure, and the extremes of those things. And Venus is also reflective of beauty and the cleanliness of the priestly life, the ceremony and the ornateness of temples and altars, also Venus. So a lot of diversity with Venus. It's really not a good idea to get, sometimes like Mars, we say the warrior, and Venus, the goddess, and the moon, the mother. And these are really not helpful, in my opinion, if we use them too singularly. And the reason for that is that these planets have several thousand years of being used and understood in really diverse ways. So at any rate, let's think of Venus now as both friendship, beauty, the arts, cleanliness, like lots of different, let's kind of talk about it from different angles. Okay, so now when you look at the square to Neptune, you have to understand that Neptune, on the other hand, represents, first of all, let me say something about the outer planets, because I think it's actually appropriate to say a little something first. One of the things in modern astrology that one way that I tend to differ a little bit from, sort of some of the modern mindset about outer planets is that I don't consider, after studying, really deeply studying Hellenistic astrology, medieval astrology, horary astrology, I don't consider the outer planets to be something that should be shoehorned into the language of ancient astrology, meaning we shouldn't think about Neptune in terms of it ruling a sign, because most people, quite frankly, don't have a really good and deep understanding of what rulerships are, what they mean, how and why they were used, how they fit into the total language of dignities, including triplicity rulers, term rulers, exaltation and depressions. Most I know for myself, I didn't have any idea what rulerships really were until I studied ancient astrology. And so after having done so, and not from I don't mean to be really grumpy about it, but it's my feeling that outer planets are really, really unique, and that they have a really important role to play in astrology, but not one that should be shoehorned into the language of dignities. They're their own category, in a sense, is what I'm trying to say. So in other words, when you think of Neptune, don't think of Pisces, and Pluto, don't think of Scorpio, and when you think of Uranus, don't think of Aquarius. Think of them as their own entities that are, in a sense, mavericks. They're very powerful symbols, no doubt, but I encourage people to just try it on for like 3 or 4 months. Don't give them to a sign, and just see how things subtly start to shift. I'd say more on it, but I don't want to labor the point. At any rate, so Neptune is a planet that is often associated with the imagination and the imaginal. It's sort of thought of in relation to the archetypal and that which is vast and oceanic and boundaryless and stuff like that. It's associated with romanticism and things like of that nature. One way that I've come to understand Neptune, really simply, to just break it down, is Neptune is like the call to the transcendental. The transcendental meaning that which exists beyond the material realm, the realm of, in the spiritual realm. And that's, it's here with us, but it's also distinctly different from the material world. The example that's often used in yoga is like a lotus flower. A lotus flower is the water does not actually absorb into the flower. The water runs right off the petal, or like water off the duck. So the spiritual world is here, but it's also different from and does not actually touch, in a sense, the material. This is why Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, says that the soul can't be burned or slashed or killed. It was never born. It never dies. It's here, but ultimately it persists beyond the body. So it's like, the lotus in water. Neptune is the call that we feel while getting totally lost in the illusion that we are the material stuff, to return to identification with spiritual stuff. And it's a very powerful calling. You can associate it with the call that we feel to reunite with spirit, that drags us into a bottle of wine, or the call that drags us to charismatic worship or chanting or singing. And not everything that calls us to transcendental reality is actually taking us there. Some of it is actually getting us more deeply enmeshed in the material reality, because we still have yet to deeply discern the difference between the two, which takes practice. It takes disciplined spiritual practice to start to identify ourselves with the lotus flower rather than the sort of material lake or water or muck or what have you that it's situated in. So it's the transcendental shimmering and shining and calling to us within this material world that we are a part of. Our egos are like the pujaris of a beautiful temple. That's a friend of mine wrote a poem about this, and it's always really stuck with me. Our egos and our bodies are like, temporary sanctuaries, and we're like, our ego's like a temporary temple keeper. And sometimes we forget that. And we forget that the soul is inhabiting this place. And so the ego, thinking that it's the supreme and the supreme destination itself, will mistakenly try to access happiness, try to create happiness for itself through all kinds of things that are very temporary and absolutely do not satisfy us. And so over time, we learn to discern, if we are on a spiritual path, we learn to discern the difference between what is a spiritual inclination and what is a material delusion. And that's really all mystic paths are teaching us that in one way or another, which is Buddhist mindfulness, or we all emphasize the same thing. So at any rate, with Neptune, you're looking at a place in your life, like if it's in your marriage house, or if it's in your career house, or if it's in your house of siblings, or your home and property house. You're looking at a place where you're going to start to get flooded by the call to the transcendental. It's like Krishna's flute is playing, the call of Dionysus or what have you. Something is pulling you and saying, you need to access spirit. You have to be in that realm. This isn't cutting it. So the world will appear intensely boring and mundane and weighty and cruel, and it just feels like a prison, or you feel lonely and abandoned and isolated and in exile, and it's just the deepest well of sorrow that makes you feel like this world is not it. And all that stuff generated by the call of Neptune, it'll just flood into your life in different areas when it's making transits in your chart. And then there's the inner prompting that we receive from that to do something about it. And so sometimes, we have a spiritual breakthrough, a spiritual existential identity crisis, or we follow the call and we do something about it, and we develop some kind of spiritual lifestyle. We learn how to listen spiritually and tune into what the soul actually wants. It's one thing, we all talk about a soul all the time, right? If you're in spiritual New Age culture, you hear the word soul thrown around a lot. But it's a lot rarer to cultivate daily devotion, practicing the actual listening to the reality of the soul and what it needs and wants. And those things are usually not found in, well, I know what I need and it's a totally new wardrobe, and I know what I need and it's a better sex life. And I know what I need and it's a better this or it's a better that. Because all of those things don't ultimately do it for the soul, who's been wandering through body after body after body for a really, really long time. And so there's no, for Neptune, there's no substitute for actual spiritual bliss and happiness. And we find that out very painfully by shedding off delusions that we have that run contrary to that fact. So that's Neptune in a nutshell. You either you feel the call and you either drink the poison, drink the potion of deepening our delusions, or you slowly start to slough off illusion, and you go through a process of disillusionment to come into some just small, even taste of the soul's life and what it needs, and real satisfaction on that level. And it's not something that's ever once and for all, right? It's a process. So we keep going in this, but that's what Neptune provides us with. So now that's a big Neptune. All right. Now that's a big, it's a big talk on Neptune. What does it mean when Venus, this planet of friendship and harmony and beauty and all this stuff, what does it mean when it squares Neptune? Well, if you're feeling, let's just start with Venus as cleanliness. Almost all religions on the planet, if you look at, Buddhism or Christianity, or if you look at Islam, if you look at yoga, they emphasize on the highest levels, the renunciates, the sannyasis, the monks, etc. They emphasize clean living. Now, I'm not going to give you a lecture on what clean living means. God knows that I am not, so clean. But there are things that we can all probably agree on that would give us the feeling that our body, our mind, our environment is toxic. We're polluted. We can see that in the world around us all the time. So anything that comes up during a Venus-Neptune transit that has to do with the feeling of being dirty, it can go to an extreme, right? You can always, Neptune-Venus could always be about the obsession with being dirty and the desire to be clean that's actually rooted in the ego, which is why, even in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna sort of paradoxically renounces renunciation. Krishna says, renunciation isn't actually the way to go. It's more mindful than just renunciation. You can't try to, you have to be human, you have to act, you have to be. So you can't just, look at your body and just start beating it with a whip or something. You can't scourge yourself. So it's not, you can be very careful, because when your ego starts to feel like something is unclean, the desire to purge with Neptune and Venus can end up being like the person who is, giving themselves some kind of Chinese water torture, the drip, drip. You're starting to dump, douse, pour things over yourself to cleanse or heal, metaphorically speaking, until it's just too much. You're overdoing some desire to get cleaner. You have to be really careful about that with Venus Neptune. Purification, obsession. The other thing that can happen with Venus and Neptune and cleanliness, on the other hand, is that we can notice the pollution. Now, Venus and Gemini, a really good pollution in a Mercury-ruled sign is mental noise. So when you're talking about the internet and websites and social media, and you're talking about newspapers and live feeds and emails and conversations and gossip and all the stuff that starts to fill our mind during Venus Neptune, can start to feel just like noise or static. You're looking for signal, not static. You're saying that's just a bunch of noise. I'm starting to feel like I have communication pollution, and I just need I need to like just dump cool water over all of it and let it all flow downstream, and be cleansed. I need to empty my mind. I need to empty my relationships, Venus, of noise, Venus in a Mercury-ruled sign, because it's starting to feel toxic. Gossip, any kind of intrigue and communication, like basically overstimulating yourself mentally and sensually, where nervous system and relationships and communication all sort of come together and just overdo things. And you can get overwhelmed and just feel like, okay, I want to quit, I want to check out. And so, it's a good time to drink, or it's a good time to slam a bunch of coffee because I'm getting so into this wired out headspace. Or it can be a time where your relationships suffer because you're just over talking the relationship to death. We've all done that before, right? Where you just sort of over talk issues. So those are all possibilities. Venus in relationships is also, with Mercury, is also about honesty and deception with Neptune. So you always want to be careful about honesty, deception, and basically manipulating facts or information in order to get something that you want. Neptune, as much as it's about the call to the transcendental, can also be about veiling, fog, delusion, deception, hiddenness, basically. It's very it's like mystical callings, but also the smoke and mirrors of a good magician, also sort of Neptune. So you can think about relationships and the ability to delude each other, or to be deluded about a relationship, or to deceive one another. So you have to be very careful about all of that as well. It can also be about honesty in relationships and clarifying your spiritual needs, compatibility or incompatibilities within a relationship, cleanliness within a relationship, and also sometimes the feeling or call to be alone, or sometimes the realization that you are alone even though you're in a social situation. These are all part of the disillusionment process of Neptune with Venus and its relational dynamics. Okay, so those are some things to think about with Venus Neptune. Be very careful of overdoing spending, intoxicants, caffeine, anything that's like consumption oriented. Again, you want to be careful of that. Venus loves pleasure. Neptune loves to make you feel like it's the ultimate highest pleasure of all time, and most things in this world can't make that mark, you know. So keep our expectations in a realistic place while we enjoy the beautiful quality of Venus Neptune. That's fine. It's a great moment to if you have a home altar, to adorn your altar, to write a nice letter, to express your love. There's a fluidity right now of self-expression, dance, creativity, artistry. These things have unusual grace and fluidity at the moment. And the ability to speak or communicate something in art is also very strong with Venus square Neptune. All right, so those are some things to think about with Venus square to Neptune. Now, Spencer has a question. Hi, Adam. Can you suggest any additional techniques for handling the more challenging aspects of Neptune, i.e. accepting things out of our control? Also, one of the challenges I'm having is a bit of depression due to a realization that our lives might be more scripted than I originally thought. Do you have any favorite coping mechanisms for coming to terms with that concept? Great questions. Yeah, sure. So accepting things that are out of our control. Well, I think, you know, not to be too trite, but I think, you know, I'm speaking now, you know, as a Bhakta, as someone who really, my heart is in Bhakti yoga. And that's, so I can speak from that space and just issue that qualifier so people know where I'm speaking from. I believe personally that most of our life is out of our control. If you sit down and try to make a list, this is something my own yoga teacher taught me. If you sit down and try to make a list of everything that you think is 100% in your control, you'll find that almost nothing actually is, right? Well, you know, I control whether I eat breakfast in the morning or not. Well, as a parent, I can tell you that that's definitely not true for me, even though it seems like the most basic thing. So I made this list because I was going through this exercise with my teacher. And it turns out that most of what we deal with in life, there is no ultimate certainty involved within any material sense. So first of all, it's my basic belief that most of life is not within our control. I've also practiced astrology now and work with, you know, many clients every year. And what I see in people's lives is that largely the outlines of our fate and destiny are mapped out from the moment that we're born. And I believe that that's deeply beautiful and reassuring and not at all troubling to me personally. So that does not cancel or invalidate my strong belief that we have agency. Here's something to think about from within the Bhakti tradition, and I've said this numerous times before, I'll say it again. This comes from not just the Bhakti tradition, but many you know, ancient mystics had very similar beliefs. And that's that our agency is not material. So for example, it's my spirit soul, right, that has agency. My spirit soul is free and is eternal. And it's the consciousness is the one that's choosing this or that, right? So, but insofar as I choose to do anything material, like reach out to the camera, the action is not free in the material sense. The action in the material sense is governed by causal mechanics. So the material world is in a sense governed by law, cause and effect. It's the place that generates the material action is the place that's free. But the material world itself, for example, thought by ancient yogis to be controlled entirely by the demigods. So the movement of my hand, the fact that that functions over and over repeatedly, or that it may malfunction, is all due to operating principles of the program of material reality, which is governed by larger forces, the demigods. So your freedom is not actually, from that standpoint, to be found in the material world. Yet we operate every day as though it is. So for example, I think that what freedom means is the freedom to pick this up or set it down. But the truth is that every time I pick this up or set it down back and forth, the action itself is bound. It's bound in a realm of cause and effect over which, once I choose to do something, I have no control. And so ancient astrologers, from Stoics to Platonists to the yogis, again, they had lots of different ways of looking at this, but that basic conception would, again, make us realize that anything you choose to do in the material world, by its very nature, as soon as you choose it, is no longer free. And we're thinking about souls whose reality in this lifetime is being informed by innumerable choices that have taken place over the course of millions of lifetimes. And so the agency that we have in any given moment is also being deeply informed and conditioned by our past lives. And so to discover real freedom, it is, first of all, for most of these traditions, is to be liberated from the sense that it's material in the first place. And in the second sense, you also have to slowly realize what freedom really is, separate from material action, over the course of gradually using your freedom in the material world to disengage from it. So that process, I know that that's deep sort of metaphysical stuff, but that process doesn't happen overnight. And one of the greatest opportunities, this is what they say, like, if God, and this is in the Bhakti tradition, if God takes everything away from you, or if you encounter a deep, grievous experience, and it's sort of out of your control, this is thought to be an incredibly auspicious moment in spiritual life, because it's a moment for real freedom to be actually accessed again, because real freedom is found in the ability to say yes to anything and everything. So Krishna says, for example, that the real sage is the one who finds contentment and steadiness, whether things are really up or whether things are really down. So in terms of the way that I would work, and this is a long answer, but in the way that I would work with that dynamic is to say, when something happens that's out of my control and it's very challenging, I immediately choose, because that's the immediate level of choice that I can try my hardest. I may not be able to do it, but I have to try to use my choice, my free will in that moment to say, this is the greatest opportunity that's ever been given to me. Because in this moment, I have the choice to accept what freedom actually is on a completely different level of awareness and consciousness. And if I can access that, it generates within me transcendental happiness, because I start seeing reality as the holodeck. I start seeing material life as not the place to find my freedom. And I get that opportunity every time my material form is disappointed by the way the material things are happening around me. But my spiritual form can say yes to it. And then the differentiation starts to occur a little bit more, and it generates joy, right? And then it generates, and from joy comes creativity, which is the ability to choose something new. And the ability to choose something new that comes from a slightly more elevated and aware place about that difference is gradually what starts liberating us over time. So at any rate, that's a long answer to it, but choose to see everything that's out of your control as actually evidence that there's a greater intelligence offering you agency again, saying, hey, here's a moment to define your sense of self, agency, and happiness according to something different. And if you can delight in that, then you have the secret. You have the real secret. Not think and you shall get what you want. The real secret is stop thinking and accept what you have. That's the real secret. But at any rate, also, one of the challenges I'm having is a bit of depression due to realization that our lives might be more scripted than I originally thought. So I think that I addressed that in what I said. So hopefully I kind of got both at the same time. Now, of course, people are totally free to disagree with me. This answer that I've given is coming from, my experiences. The things that have really informed my perspective are, 10 years of drinking ayahuasca and being on the yogic path and really studying theology from both a mystical Christian standpoint and from the yogic standpoint, with deep respect for Buddhism as well. So, and from daily practice, more than anything though, from sadhana, from actual devotional practice. So that, and just trying to live this way, failing miserably all the time, but just giving it my best, we should all try to give it our best. All right. Lisa says, I have been hacking away at my hair. Operation Even It. I would love to shave it off. Does this sound like Neptune squaring Venus? No, sounds more like Uranus doing something to Venus in your birth chart, but I could be wrong. Sounds radical. I like it though. I hope feel free to do it. Okay, let's see. Okay, beautiful. So that concludes Venus Neptune. Now, last but not least, Mercury square to Pluto and Mars. And that's going to cut around an hour when we're done, but I've been out of town for a while. We need to catch up. So, all right. So Mercury square Pluto, that's just finishing, and Mercury is engaging now with a square to Mars. So everyone should feel nice and full of Mercury in Aries, because Mercury has been in Aries since basically the beginning of March. So that's 2 full months. I think it was March 6th. I could be wrong, but it was like right around there that, Mercury entered Aries and just turned up the mental heat. Just whether you're traveling or dealing with car issues or technology issues or communication dynamics or thinking, etc. Just to give you a simple example, right? Mercury in a Mars-ruled fire sign, a masculine yang, it's like that. And it went through a whole big retrograde, it's been back and forth with Saturn, all this stuff. As soon as this came in, and I have got Saturn opposite my natal Mercury right now, so we got some Mercury dynamics going on. As soon as it came in, I started noticing that there was, a general theme in my life of, basically a very analytical person, a thinker. And, but I just been to India and have really been deepening my devotional practices and basically really working within myself to bring heart and head together, because sometimes it's easy to sort of quarantine the two. Like, okay, well, when I'm on my yoga mat, I open my heart, but when I'm at home, I study my books, and like I'm critical in the classroom when I teach, thinking and everything. But then, if I'm teaching a yoga class at our studio, then I'm like I have more of a devotional mood. And I just noticed that the two were really like separate for me. And this was not something that I really loved, because it also allows me to be very critical when I feel I want to be of others or the environment or whatever. But at other times I can be like sweet and generous and thoughtful. Right? It's like, this something has to shift here, because becoming aware of the dichotomy within myself in a way that was beginning to feel really painful. And something's ready to change when it's getting to that point where you're just like, I just can't take it anymore. I've got to integrate. Right? Really, right? Well said. So, at any rate, this is right as Mars or Mercury enters Aries, and keep in mind that this is happening as Saturn is going through a long opposition to Mercury in my natal chart, which is conjoined with Mars. So you can almost always, that's a side note to say that these dynamics that we're talking about in the sky will amplify, trigger, or basically expand upon some deeper, longer, slower moving transit that's happening in your birth chart. And that's how sometimes you'll know, like for example, having Saturn opposite my natal Mercury and knowing, Mercury in Aries in my 12th house will be going through this square, T-squaring the transiting Saturn through this long retrograde, and then squaring my natal Mercury. Okay, so that's a moment during the 1.5 year long period of Saturn opposite my Mercury where things might get amplified, because Mercury's triggering and interacting really dynamically with the already moving transit in the birth chart. And that's something you can do with your own chart all the time. If you can't follow that, don't worry, it's kind of advanced. But at any rate, as this came in, I thought, well, I got to start working on this. So I came up with this criticism wristband challenge, which I won't go into because I've gone into it a bunch already. But so I've been working really diligently on critical speech. And it's been going really well. I've been learning so much. It's sort of a mindfulness with speech practice that I've been taking on. And a lot of people have been doing it with me. We've our yoga studio, I think we gave out about 500 of these wristbands total. So at any rate, but guess what it also had me doing? It had me, when Mercury was square to Saturn, back and forth, Saturn, tedious, long, restrictive, serious. Oh, I was sitting at my desk for I think 3 hours labeling and stuffing envelopes with these bands, and then I was in an hour, 2 hours at the post office standing there while the guy had to, get the postage set for every one of these hundreds of envelopes. So, it was like that was all like Mercury, Saturn. So at any rate, everyone should be nice and familiar with, but maybe also a little tired of Mercury traveling through Aries right now. It's gone through a lot with Saturn. It's gone back and forth with Mars and Pluto. It's had a lot of engagement with planets all 2 months now. Yesterday, as it was perfecting, as Mercury Square Pluto was perfecting on an airplane, I got into a situation where, I have a 2-year-old daughter on the airplane, and this woman was being very inflexible about seating so that my daughter and I could be together and in a way that was best for my daughter, given just her dynamics on airplanes. And this woman was being really sort of inflexible about it. And I am not the type to do this, but here's Mercury and Pluto, and I've got this criticism wristband on. And I really had to hold back from totally going off on her, and it was a really challenging moment. But that was Mercury exactly squared up, moving right into the Pluto square. So, and I had a sort of weirdly intense conversation about car stuff with my wife last night. So all intense, cathartic, difficult, deep, purgative kinds of conversations or communication dynamics have been in the air for about a week now, but even longer than that with Mercury and Aries for 2 months. So that's finishing up. You might have felt that catharsis pretty powerfully over the last 24 hours. You could still feel it pretty powerfully in the next day or two. The next thing that's happening is Mercury is moving into a square with Mars, as if we haven't had enough of the Mercury-Mars dynamic already. As it's doing so, it's also moving into a conjunction with Uranus, as Uranus is changing signs. Like I said, we'll talk more about the Uranus changing signs into Taurus shortly, but last thing you should know is that this perfects basically between Friday the 11th and Saturday the 12th. Right about there, Mercury will move right over the conjunction with Uranus, right as Mars starts squaring Uranus. So I'm just going to give you the short and sticky on this one, since I'll be talking about it more later. Here's the post-it note. Rebellion and confrontation, rebelliousness, defiance, confrontive qualities in speech and in mind, but also breakthroughs, ideas, inventiveness, and aha moments that pierce, that penetrate, that get you roused up and inspired. Those are all kind of in the air coming up now. But with that comes excessive heat. So here's what I would really be careful of. You got heat and you got fire and earth. What they share qualitatively is dryness. So fire and earth are both very dry. So keep really well hydrated this week, even though it sounds crazy because, it's there's astrological energies. But if you feel yourself getting intense, agitated, even inspired and creative, just keep adding water to it. And one of the main reasons for that is that the level of determination is very high with this transit, and to do something about it, to say something, to confront, to stand up to break through, to invent, to say something controversial, to tangle up, with someone, to get in a thumb wrestling match with somebody about something. Those are there, especially when it comes to independence and freedom and something that you think is your right or something like that. Strong Uranus, Mercury dynamics, but also, even if you have amazing, brilliant ideas that flash out of nowhere and you're going to go do it, when we get into that mode, we tend to leave our bodies a little bit. And when we leave our bodies a little bit, we're not always doing the most grounded thing. It's easy to become accident prone, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's why add water, because it'll just cool it down a little bit and remind you to be thorough and careful and mindful. So that's the kind of transit that's coming with Mercury to Mercury square to Mars and conjunction with Uranus, but just add water. Okay. That's what I have for you guys. I hope that this was really interesting. Any questions that I missed, I'm going to look up for right now. Where do you get your information from on the planets? Book recommendations. Yeah, so there's lots of good books. I think a great, it depends kind of on what level you're at. If you're totally brand new to astrology, there's actually a 2-volume set called Mapping the Psyche, Volume 1 and 2. And I forget, it's Claire Martin, I think. And it's a nice intro kind of book. There's another good book for very basic, kind of intro level, but for people who maybe know something already, and that would be Horoscope Symbols by Rob Hand, maybe a little bit more intermediate, but it's really solid on the fundamentals. So those are maybe some get starteds. If you want to know more about outer planets, I like Cosmos and Psyche. It's a good one. Yeah, there's another good one called The Archetypal Universe that just came out from a friend, colleague, Ren Butler. That's a good one for just learning about the planets and combinations. But otherwise, I get my information, a lot of it, honestly, comes from experience. And that happens over time. There's no better teacher in astrology than experience, actually watching and learning from the astrology itself and your experiences. Astrology, at the end of the day, isn't the teacher. Life is. Astrology is it's like saying, in a sense, it's not the music, right? It's not the music. It's what the music does to the soul. The way that the music touches the soul, the way that it comes from the soul. Ultimately, astrology is the very same way. It's putting words and language around things that are happening. And so, if you pay attention to the way that the language corresponds with what's happening, we're all ready to be experts in astrology, so long as we're ready to listen to our experiences and try to understand how they match up with the language of this ancient symbolic system. Opposition on Sun-Taurus axis would this bring up issues of power, subterranean, and versus manifest? So for me, I don't spend a lot of time looking at the signs as much as, let's say, a modern astrologer would, even though I'm a modern astrologer, but because I practice ancient astrology primarily, ancient astrologers didn't spend as much time thinking about the signs in and of themselves. They would think about the signs in terms of the planets that ruled them. So when I think about the Taurus-Scorpio axis, I'm thinking about the Mars-Venus dynamic. I'm not thinking about, bulls and scorpions as much. I'm not thinking about, peace-loving, apple pie, barefoot-wearing, goddesses versus, deep, intense, jealous lovers. Those psychological descriptions or characteristics of the signs are definitely true, and they have interesting correspondence to the seasonal dynamics of the solar year, but they are not, in my opinion, they're not nearly as reliable as just understanding straight away, okay, if we have a full moon across Scorpio Taurus, we're talking about the quality of a full moon, and we're talking about it relating or expressing itself through the oppositional tension of Mars and Venus, because it's hanging out in Mars and Venus's temples. And that's how the signs were sort of originally conceptualized. So I wouldn't say power, visible, and hidden. You could say visible and hidden because there's a spring sign and a fall sign, right? And so the fall might be more hidden and spring more visible, or light and dark, or something like that. But I'm careful not to fall into the temptation of the modern psychological characterizations of the signs, because it's actually much better to think in terms of planets, not signs. But that's just, again, that's how I teach and how I operate. Like cookies and coffee. Yeah, be careful with the coffee. Transiting Neptune trine my Venus. Oh, good. That should help with that one too. The trine is going to be a little bit more helpful for you. Let's see. How it works when your natal Mercury is retrograde with the square to Mars. Well, you'd have to be, just quickly, you have to be very careful about, sort of explosive speech dynamics or repressive speech dynamics, or a seesaw between the two, with the Mercury retrograde square to a Mars. Like, I'm going to hold back, and then I'm done holding back and I'm going to punch, like that kind of back and forth. Or the tendency to have your mind potentially abused or sort of beat down, depending upon if Mars is superior to Mercury or not, and how close they are applying or separating. Be careful of being mentally dominant or dominating others in speech, or being a bully or being bullied. Those are two to be very careful of with Mars square Mercury, especially when Mercury is retrograde. Can also be about the difficulties with speech or learning. Sometimes too, those things come up with Mercury retrogrades and Mars. Sometimes issues around cognitive issues too. Okay, which house system do you prefer? Whole sign houses. Use whole sign houses. I'm going to talk about that at some point. People have been asking. Okay, thank you everyone so much. We're over an hour, so I'm going to end now. Hope you all have a very beautiful week, and let me know your stories about these things. I always love hearing people's stories. And if you want, don't forget, you can still reach out and purchase a Uranus into Taurus report. They're short and sweet. They're 40 to 75 suggested donation. You can email me if you'd like one at nightlightastrology@gmail.com. Take care, everyone. Bye.